Our next speaker is Brad Carlson. Brad is an extension educator with the University of Minnesota. He grew up on a small farm in Waseca and got his master's degree in soil science at the U. Interesting enough, Brad and I both got our undergraduate degrees at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and we had the same advisor. The only difference was I was Ron Hensler's first student and Brad's was his last. So that makes me feel pretty old. So today Brad's going to talk about indecisions based on climate data. So please welcome Brad.
All right, is this thing functional?
We're working on it.
No, but as far as the remote. Okay. Well, while the presentation is being brought up, I'll just say a couple things about what I'm going to present today. So this is decanted from a 3-hour curriculum that we developed. I think a lot of you are familiar with that. We've been working on the Nitrogen Smart program here for a number of years. And we started developing advanced Nitrogen Smart curriculums that were focused on topic areas starting about 4 years ago. And so we were 5 years ago, I guess maybe we didn't get one done during the COVID year, but to the point where we've got 4 different of these things, and they're like 3 hours long. And the one that we ran out last year is on adapting nitrogen management to climate, which is the topic I'm talking about today. So this presentation is kind of skimming off some of the information off of that, and it's really kind of a conceptual thing as far as I'm not so much concerned with telling a story from the front to the end of this presentation so much as conveying the mindset about how we think about what the climate is giving us and how we make modification in our nitrogen management decisions. And so that's really kind of where I'm going to go with this thing. I guess I will put a little plug in though. If you want to see the full thing, if you're interested in the other curriculums we have for the Advanced Nitrogen Smart, and by the way, we are offering CEUs now. We'll have a number of opportunities. Next week, we're going to be on the road with the new one that we're doing, reducing nitrate loss to water. Is going to be on Monday afternoon at Lamberton, Tuesday afternoon at Waseca, Wednesday afternoon we're going to be in Paynesville up at the Legion. Then on Thursday we're going to do our deep dive into the 4 hours. Training is going to be Thursday morning in Ada, and then on Friday morning we're going to be in Morris at the research station there, doing the full session on this one. And then coming up the last day of February and the first day of March, the 28th and the 1st, we're going to be in Faribault at the 4-H building with what we call Nitrogen College, which is really just that we're going to deliver all 4 of these curriculums over 2 days. And you don't have to come and sit through the whole thing, but if there's various of these curriculums and trainings you want to go to, you're able to kind of just choose the ones and come and go from those. No pre-registration, no cost, thanks to the generous support of the corn growers. So we'll get that plug in. So as far as what I'm going to talk about here today, I guess just a tiny little bit of the background of why we've been doing these programs, and sort of as well as what this information is leading towards. I think most folks are aware of the fact that we are kind of on the hook for a 45% reduction in the total flux of nitrogen going down the Mississippi River where it crosses the state line. And that's still out there. The nutrient reduction strategy is being rewritten in 2025. And so we've already started work on that. And so some of this information is being used for evaluating kind of what progress we've made. And in a lot of cases, unfortunately, we haven't made a lot of progress. There's been reductions in nitrate concentration in waters that has been unfortunately offset by increased flow in the rivers. So the total amount of nitrogen coming down has been fairly equal. And so that's something we're going to have to struggle with. And obviously that's very related to climate issues. In addition to that, we've been looking at what kind of modifications might be made with nitrogen best management practices. There's a couple of things in there specifically that have kind of become problematic. Dan Kaiser, who's my partner in doing the Nitrogen Smart stuff, is ultimately responsible for kind of the university's side of BMPs. And there needs to obviously be some justification and science behind changes in those. And so some of this information is also advising that process. You know, we know that the extent to which BMPs are being followed is kind of debatable depending on where you're at. I think the one that, of course, is maybe the biggest question mark is the rate. Unfortunately, what we've kind of discovered in a lot of cases where a rate that's too high is being used is because it's being used as a compensation for other factors, others of the 4Rs, particularly the timing, and then to some extent the type of fertilizer that's chosen, and so in some cases rates being jacked up just to make up for that. And we really would like to emphasize that that really selecting that whole package is what's necessary in order to be most efficient with our nitrogen resources. So we know that the nitrogen cycle drives based on climate conditions. The conversion of ammonium into nitrate is a microbial process, as is denitrification, the loss, and those are heat and moisture dependent, as well as time, which of course is not really a weather factor, but time's a part of that. And that nitrate is the weak link. And so in a lot of cases, if we can at least think about, I don't know if I want to say the word model, because really in a lot of cases, we're just thinking about in our heads kind of where we're at status wise with the applied fertilizer. As far as its conversion to nitrate, we can start thinking about whether it's experienced any kind of pressure on the loss side. And so the other part about this that we've got fairly good documentation of, and going back to a lot of the research that Giles Randall did on the drainage plots at Waseca, is documenting the fact that a large portion of the nitrate that we'd lose to surface waters is being accumulated post-growing season. That while there is some unused fertilizer and some portion of applied fertilizer that's lost, provided you're following best management practices, in a lot of cases, a large amount of the nitrogen coming out in water is accumulated by soil mineralization post-growing season and then flushed out before the next year when the crop gets up and growing and taking that up. And so that's also a factor to be thinking about because that's happening at kind of an off time of the year. It's a little bit of a separate topic because it's going to require some different management other than simply thinking about fertilizer management, but it's kind of part of this. And so the educational message that we've been delivering through the Nitrogen Smart programs is that BMPs are a starting point. That there definitely is not a one size fits all with nitrogen management. I think everybody recognizes that if you get to the end of the year and you've had a rate trial, you can know exactly what the exact right rate was in that given year. But of course, we're always sitting here looking forward to the coming year and trying to decide what that should be. And so in a lot of cases, farmers are conservative enough that they really don't want to take a lot of risk related to that. And so most cases, you're just simply applying enough to make sure that most of the time it's going to be enough. Ultimately, I think we need to start looking at whether we're going to have to adapt that thought process. Right now, we're not quite there. But I guess the key thing to be thinking about is because the loss processes of nitrogen are dependent on soil and climate, that we can actually think in a more scientific way whether we have experienced those conditions and adapt accordingly. One of the changes in philosophy that Dan Kaiser has brought with him as our state nutrient management specialist is one of looking at probability. And I know, like, for instance, those of you familiar with our P&K recommendations know that when you get into the higher test categories, Dan's kind of brought this, this look at what's the chances you still get a response to applied fertilizer. It gets back to this idea that we can take, and Fabian showed some of this data also, you can take 4 years and you can average it out and not find a statistical difference. But what if there was 3 years, there wasn't a difference, and one that there was a difference? Okay, so really, instead of saying on average, this doesn't work, instead you say 25% of the time it worked. And now we need to start thinking about what are the conditions under which that 25% of the time happened. And so really thinking about climate in that way, we can start looking at what are the odds that we lost nitrogen, what are the odds we needed more nitrogen, what are the odds we needed to change our timing. and so forth. And so that's really kind of the thought process that we've been trying to instill related to this training on the climate. So we know that obviously the application timing is probably one of the big factors in this. There are differences in fertilizer types. A lot of the data is shown pretty clearly that obviously urea application in the fall is not really in our best interest. And so when it comes then to that timing aspect, the options are pretty limited. When it comes to pre-plant applications, obviously we got a lot more choices at our disposal. But we do need to think about some of those fertilizer types and application methods and whether they're problematic just given the specific conditions. The use of inhibitors is continually a question. It's not really an issue of do they work, because they're well established. For instance, the nitrification inhibitors that are on the market are well established that they work. It's just a question of were they necessary given the climate conditions. And so from that standpoint, it's not an issue of is this going to work? Is this not going to work? Are the conditions such where this makes sense to invest in this? And so that's also something to be thinking about. We keep getting questions about side dress. Unfortunately, there's been sort of this message out there that somehow spoon feeding the crop is a thing. It's not really a thing. The analogy I keep using of that is that if you want to eat a can of Campbell's soup, you go to the pantry and there's a can of Campbell's soup there. You don't care if that your wife bought it last week or if it was, been sitting in there for 2 years. It's a can of Campbell's soup and it's probably going to be just fine. Cornfield's the same way about nitrogen. It's either there or it's not there, and so side dressing it really is more of an issue of worrying about whether you've experienced loss process than whether you need to have that nitrogen fresh, because that doesn't really matter. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the weather data that we've been using for the sake of taking a look at this stuff. And I think it's important to recognize, we know that anytime we start using average climate data or climate data that was tied to a specific site, there's always going to be people who say, well, that's not my area, or how do we know going forward? And you don't know going forward. And so that's why, this is used for developing a thought process. It's not something we can hang our hat on. It's not like Memorial Day that it occurs on the calendar on this day every year, and we know exactly when it is. It's going to change from one year to the next. But from that standpoint, we did a lot of looking, particularly with our precipitation data, with the data collected at Waseca, because it's a well-organized and long-term data set, and it was easy to work with. And so I guess from there, people need to kind of think about the fact that, wherever you're at is going to vary from one side to the other, but it's always going to vary from year to year anyway. And everybody realizes that precip data can vary 5 miles down the road significantly too. So, it's difficult to be just too precise with that. This is something that's been shared for a long time. When we look at the rolling 30-year averages, that the advance in the amount of precip we're getting annually has been increasing steadily. We're 10 inches up from where we were in 1960, which of course at that point in time it included the 1930s in that calculation, Dust Bowl years. But regardless, it's worth at least thinking in the back of our mind. We're having to deal with a lot more water to manage, and because of the impact of water on nitrogen management, it's something to keep front and center. We worked with Stefan Lees, who is a technician who works for Tracy Twine in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate, did our GIS products. And I worked with Stefan, kind of told him the things I wanted, and he gave me GIS products back. And so these are a couple of the maps that we've got here. And I guess what I want to show here, so currently the one on the left is the statewide annual precip in inches per year. Although the one on the right, instead of it being the 30-year, it's just the last 10. This does not include our last 2 drought years, and it's not intentional that we wanted to drop those off. It's that this has to do with when these things were produced, and that data wasn't there yet. But anyway, if you just simply look at the last 10, you can see that it has been even way wetter, than the 30-year average. And so that's obviously something that we need to take into consideration. This is an old chart Giles Randall used. I've used it a lot of times in a lot of different contexts, but it illustrates the point that once the corn gets up and growing, which is our black line there, that the amount of water coming through drain tile decreases, just simply put that the crop starts using water. And so even though it's falling from the sky, the odds of it ending up getting lost, and in our case, the odds of it taking nitrate with it, just decrease as the growing season goes along. So that's something to be thinking about, that really it's that period before the crop gets growing that we really need to focus a lot on as far as nitrate loss when we think about how we're going to end up correcting a lot of these water quality issues. And this is just some of the numbers from one of the publications one of the articles Giles put out that divides it by month. And so this is, I think most people recognize that the majority of the flow through drain tile, and therefore most of the nitrogen is coming out in April, May, and June, and trickling into July. So for the sake of looking at this, we had Stefan look at the water budget during those months. And so this is March, April, May, and June. And so we took the precipitation and we subtracted the evapotranspiration. So that's the water use, how much evaporates and how much is picked up by the plants. And the current rolling 30-year average of this for those 4 months is in the middle. And so there's a couple things that's worth noting here. The one on the left is 1961 through 1990. What's significant about that? That's what that was at the time our nitrogen best management practices were developed in 1994. And so the one on the right is just looking at the last 10 years. And so when we talk about the fact that we're probably going to be changing nitrogen best management practices, this really kind of gets to the bottom of why a lot of that might be happening, because while we have Southwest Minnesota developed as a separate BMP zone, if you look at that chart on the right, it's pretty hard to argue that there's a lot of difference in the southern third of Minnesota going all the way across the state. We know that obviously there's soil type differences in southeast Minnesota that's going to dictate some of those changes. And you can really see that the only area that really distinguishes itself currently as far as climate data is the Red River Valley. So that's a lot of what we're looking at when we think about how we're going to potentially change BMPs going forward. I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about the temperature too. Again, this is all just for the sake of kind of getting into thinking about what the impacts are of nitrogen and how we might adjust our management from one year to the next. Obviously, temperature is used to track heat units. I'm not going to get into the calculation of that. I don't have time for that. But you can look at temperature averages and then start putting calendar dates on the average day things happen. And so, from that standpoint, we can start thinking about those days and evaluating what risk is, and also think a little bit about our time and our workload considerations, because we also know that a lot of what happens nitrogen management wise has a whole lot of do I have time to get this done, and will I get it done wrapped into it. So again, looking at the Waseca data, where we start calculating heat units on May 1st, and I got some benchmark numbers from Jeff Coulter, our corn agronomist. Using those and the averages over the last 30 years, we would see that the average date of corn emergence would be May 16th, V4, which is our typical side dress time, typically happens around June 2nd, V12, which is kind of the drop dead as far as putting on any kind of side dress. We really don't see any response in Minnesota past V12 on an application. A side dress is about June 30th. The average black layer at Waseca for 100-day relative maturity hybrids is going to be on September 21st. Although, if you look at the chart of and I'll have that graph here later on, the uptake of nitrogen, we know that the amount of nitrogen uptake is slowed significantly by the time it hits black layer. Really, the previous 3 weeks from that, there's not been a lot of nitrogen taken up. You look at that data that this says 2 of the last 10. I think last year now would add to this. So I think we're actually looking at like 3 of the last 12. We've experienced a killing frost prior to when we hit black layer, just simply based on, you know, the accumulation of heat units. And that's worth noting because we all recognize that we really are stretching it in Minnesota for corn production, that we've really squeezed in as much crop production into the growing season that we have as we possibly can. The average date of a first frost at Waseca is October 4th. The other thing I guess I like to remind people, because we keep hearing folks say, well, you know, if there's climate change and it's warmer in the fall, you know, maybe we're going to be able to change, you know, some of our practices and so forth. The thing you have to keep remembering is, you know, after the 22nd of September, every day is getting shorter. And so even if these days that some of these temperature thresholds are hit get to be a little bit later, we're not talking about quality days in the fall that we can continue to grow corn and so forth. There's still short days, you know, relative to what we experienced in the summertime. This is just kind of a smoothed out chart looking at rates of nitrification based on temperatures. And so the kind of the key dates for this, we know that nitrification continues to happen as long as the temperature is above freezing, below freezing. It probably is still happening at a very, very minute level, but, you know, just like, you know, you realize that if you leave food in your refrigerator, eventually it will go bad. However, if it's in the freezer, it's probably going to get freezer burned before it actually experiences any kind of decay. Similarly speaking, we don't get too concerned about what's happening in the soil when it's frozen. The average freeze date at Waseca is December 9th. The average date that the frost comes out is March 8th. And then if we think about that magic temperature of 50 degrees, where we have that break point in the rate of nitrification, that date on average at Waseca is October 18th, and it gets above that point on May 1st, which is curiously, you know, the day we start accumulating heat units on an official basis. So the other thing I guess that's you know, worth thinking about is we know that the wetter the soil is, the slower it is to change, that those numbers are going to vary more widely when the soils are dry. Historically, we've had drier falls and it's been getting wetter in the fall, and that's been having some implications on when we reach that temperature and whether it stays stable. It's been getting slightly later, but not a lot. Given some of those dates, though, we can take a look at some of the classic research, and there's not really important for you guys to zero in on these. I realize they're small, but there is just there's data out there on rates of nitrification based on soil temperature. There's rates of denitrification based on soil temperature. There's rates of the degradation of nitropyron based on soil temperature. We can use some of that data to start thinking about what might be going on in the soil based on what the soil temperature is and the amount of time, just kind of using some of these rates. Obviously, you know, the precision that any of this happens is all going to be kind of only ballpark because the conditions are always going to be slightly different. Again, it's getting into that mindset though of thinking about whether we can keep track of this stuff and adjust our management based on what the year is giving us. You know, one of the things that a lot of us were excited about a few years ago were the crop models that were looking at tracking this data and modeling what was going on in the soil. Unfortunately, a lot of those products have either gone off the market or they've kind of faded into the background. A lot of our research did show that there was some potential on those. We weren't really seeing any spectacular failures with those. In a lot of cases where they were advising putting on lower rates of nitrogen based on conditions, we were discovering that we were getting the equivalent yield for when we were applying full rate, and they seem to be doing a decent job. You know, in the future, I think it's possible that these things might make a comeback for this purpose. We looked at nitropyron. Dan Kaiser calculated based on the labeled rate of N-serve that if you did a fall application with anhydrous, obviously, of course, the concentration is going to vary depending on how far you are away from the release point. But Roughly speaking, Dan calculated that it's present in the soil at about 2.5 parts per million, where the release point is of anhydrous. The literature indicates that nitropyron's effective down to about 1 part per million. So, roughly speaking, it's going to stay effective until it's about 50% degraded. If you do the math based on those numbers I just showed you, and you looked at those charts and those curves, if you applied anhydrous with N-Serve on the date on October 18th, the date that the soil temperature gets to 50 degrees, it's going to maintain that concentration level until about April 17th, that's a pretty good span of time. That gets us right to about corn planting time. Interesting enough, one of the current promotional pieces from Corteva on the product says it maintains effectiveness for about 8 weeks. And actually, if you look at that period of time and you subtract out the time that the soil's frozen, that's actually about 11. So it's actually a little bit even potentially longer than what their advertising is saying. However, every fall we get these calls. Those of us in extension get these calls. We're not the nitrogen police, but I guess it's convenient for somebody to call and say, hey, they're out in the field putting on anhydrous, near whatever town it is in whatever part of the state. We can say, well, we can go out in the media and talk about it, but we can't, we're not going to go out and arrest them. That's not what we do, and so forth. And anyway, but we did want to take a look at that, like what happens if you're out there early. And so I used some of these charts and just did a little back of the envelope calculation. If you went out 10 days early and the soil temperature was at 55 degrees, that would equate to about 25% conversion of the ammonium into nitrate prior to the date we hit 50 degrees. So if you look at the conversion rate, from some of that research, the conversion amount between 50 and freezing is about 15%. And so that difference is you're looking at 40% already changed to nitrate, but by the time the soil gets frozen versus only 15%. And so that's kind of what's at stake if people are out there excessively early. So we know that nitrification starts again when we thaw the soils out, and that date is obviously going to vary. This is an interesting chart, though. We looked at the date that the frost went out of the soil at Waseca and charted a trend line, and and this is number of days that the soil is frozen is on the bottom. So there's a trend line saying that the number of days the soil is frozen is longer, and it's getting longer. And the reason for that is that the soils are wetter. It takes energy to thaw frozen soil. And so if the soil goes into the fall dry, it's going to come out earlier. If the soil goes into the fall wet, it just takes a lot more heat and energy to thaw water than it does to heat up air. And so there's actually, despite the thought of warmer climate and so forth, the actual trend for soil temperature has been to have longer periods that the soil is frozen. So going back to our analogy that I kind of calculated out, there's on average right now, there's 53 days between the time the frost comes out and that May 1st, when the soil temperature hits 50. And so you'd see about 20% more conversion of ammonium to nitrate, given that, again, just that general rule of thumb from the research that's out there. So the difference in that conversion between the early application, the guy that went out 10 days early versus the one that waited until it was 50 degrees is 60% versus 35%. And so it's pretty significant. Now, roughly speaking, nitropyron degradation using that chart would be about 55% by the time we got to May 1st, or, like I said, April 17th is about the time it hits 50. Obviously, the concentration is going to vary from being highly concentrated at the release point to more dilute, and as you spread out from the distance from that. So it's only going to be approximate anyway. But the difference, though, if you look at the rates of degradation from some of the research, that if you said, well, I put on N-Serve so I can go out there early, actually that 50% point is reached on March 28th if you went out 10 days early. versus April 17th. And so it's pretty significant because, you know, we're not out in the field planting corn on March 28th, and it can still be pretty darn wet on March 28th. Another area that's kind of curiosity is the number of working days that we have available to get nitrogen applied. The total number of days in between the time the soil temperature hits 50 and the time the soil freezes at Waseca is 51 days. That's actually a pretty wide window. You know, a lot of people say, like, oh, we got to get things done in the fall. Well, actually 51 days is actually on average, that's a pretty long window. From one year to the next, we know there's going to be bad years and so forth, but on average, there is time to get fall nitrogen applied. It's probably doesn't justify a lot of early application. Thinking about the working days in the growing season can be a little bit more problematic. When I was doing research on this, I tried to figure out if there was a definition for this. And when I talked to our folks with the Department of Ag and the National Ag Statistics Service, I was reminded, and it was like, oh yeah, from earlier in my career when I was a county agent and used to fill out the USDA crop reports, the first thing on a USDA crop report on the top, it says how many days in the past week were suitable for field work. So we've actually been tracking for a very long time days suitable for field work. Now, unfortunately, Minnesota is a big state and it covers a pretty wide area, but we can take a look at what the averages say based on those crop reports, if you get the data, which I did. In addition to that, Bill Lazarus, who's one of our ag economists, put a model together looking at the climate data at Lamberton, where he modeled working days. Anyway, what I kind of discovered, first of all, you know, if we think about, you know, pre-plant period, if we think about roughly March 20th, probably at the early side of doing nitrogen applications through the end of April. We don't collect that data in March, and so I don't really know what that number is, but I think we all recognize that it's not a very big number, that there's not a lot of days in March that are suitable to work in. There are going to be years where it is possible. But if we look at the first 2 weeks of April, that's anywhere from 3 to 5 working days is what we typically find. There's a 40% chance that it's 0, and there's about a 50% chance it's 5 or higher. If we look at the last 2 weeks of April, it's another 3 to 4 days. And so then we go past that to the first 2 weeks of May, and we got about 6.5 days, typically speaking, if to do a nitrogen application. So we think about the potential for loss for pre-plant nitrogen. We know that denitrification is also temperature dependent, that the rates of denitrification are pretty slow when it comes to cold temperatures. We don't see a lot of it. If you look at that chart previously, it showed like 6% loss at 40 degrees soil temperature, and that was over 10 days. But, you know, that being said, if you've already converted large portions of your nitrate, of your nitrogen to nitrate, and it is saturated in the fall and the early spring, you are dealing with, you know, with roughly 60, 80 days. That can be pretty significant at that point. So, looking at this from the average precip data, between mid-May and late June, the last 10 years, we've had an average of 4.9 inches. If you use the book value, the amount of evapotranspiration in that period of time is 3 inches. And so we get roughly about 2 inches. We get roughly about 2 inches of excess precip during that window. That's going to interfere with field operations or potentially drive nitrogen loss. Most drainage systems in southern Minnesota are designed to a 1/2 inch drainage coefficient, meaning it can remove a 1/2 inch of water in 24 hours. So it'll take about 2 days to get rid of 1 inch of excess precip. And so given the fact that, you know, that we've got roughly 2 inches of excess precip compared to ET, you know, about 2 days of tile drainage can take that out. So then if you start looking at the actual data, because it's not all just evenly placed, what I calculated was that in the last 10 years, we've only had about 2 days of severe denitrification potential where the soil temperatures are warm. and the loss was really high. Not necessarily a thing to need to worry about, but it is a situation where you do need to be aware of the conditions that will set that up, because it does happen from time to time and place to place. I know Jeff was working on a project that I was involved with, and we did a study in 2014 near Blooming Prairie, and we had a site that had really severe loss. It was saturated in June, almost 3 weeks, and that can be severe. So if we think about, this classic, the classic nitrogen uptake graph that gets flashed up all the time, obviously you want the majority of your nitrogen taken up before the crop starts growing. It hits that rapid phase at about V4, V6. And so if you look again back to some of the numbers I calculated for Waseca, VE is about May 16th, V4 on June 2nd, V12 on June 30th. And so we need to just simply think about what's the working days we've got available. If I used an arbitrary number just based on my own experience of 4/10 of an inch of rain, usually if you get 1/3 of an inch or less, you can probably get out in the field yet that day. But if we get towards a 1/2 inch, it's going to keep you out of the field for a day or so. The rates of evapotranspiration are considered to be 1/10 of an inch a day between V2 and V6, and 1800ths between V6 and V12. And so just based on ET, it would take 10 days in early June to get rid of an inch. It would take 5 days by mid-June. So if we use that in calculating, we end up with 7 to 8.5 working days in late May, where we could still do an application, 8 to 11 days in the first 2 weeks of June, and 15 to 20. That adds up to 15 to 20 where we can get a top dress or side dress done. So I'm kind of wrapping things up here. As I said, I wasn't so much trying to tell a story from front to back so much as throw some data out and get you thinking about how we can start using these numbers to make management decisions. But one of the things that we've kind of looked at with the amount of excess precip we've had in the last few years is that the fall urea data has not looked good. And so that's, we've also, beyond the research data showing yields, we've also got climate data that kind of backs up why that's happening. We need to have a stronger emphasis on fall soil temperature for fall application because of the sensitivity to early applications. Once the temperature is above 50, that rate of nitrification coupled with that long period of time just sets us up for problems. We need to understand the limits of nitrification inhibitors. As I said, it's not usually a question of whether they work. They work. It's just a matter of whether they pay for themselves. In an ideal world, farmers would come into every growing season with a complete blank slate for nitrogen management, and they'd be allowed to just choose whatever product and application timing seemed to fit best. But I think we recognize that the input side does require that we have to make some commitments as far as the product and how much we're going to buy and so forth. But we should be thinking from the flexible standpoint that we do want to be able to adapt and adjust to some extent based on what the conditions are. Dan Kaiser's thrown this out in one of our sessions, and I would like to stress it also. The question is, do you plan for the best or do you plan for the worst? Because if you plan for the worst, you're just going to simply be over applying most of the time. If you plan for the best, there's going to always be at least that bare minimum, and then you can think about how do I supplement if the conditions got worse. So that's it. Thank you. As I said, Dan and I kind of do this together. Stefan was our technician that put together a lot of our GIS products, and Minnesota Corn paid for a lot of this work. And so I don't know if there's time for questions. I think I'm getting close to my time limit. Okay, would side dressing nitrogen be a best management practice when looking at providing nitrogen when the plant is needing it, provide less time for loss? Really, the advantage to side dress comes down to, do you have conditions which would drive nitrogen loss? And so it's one of the reasons why we recommend multiple splits on sandy soils and irrigation. For our fine textured soils, in my opinion, the whole side dress thing is more of a time management issue, because we've got the data that shows there's a lot of time and ability to get into the field to do side dress, and particularly if it's corn following soybeans, which is a rotation that is very forgiving for later applications. Corn on corn may be a little bit more sensitive to having early season applications. Really, the side dress needs to be used either as a timing issue, potentially variable rate issue if you're going to variable rate, and then to a lesser extent than a loss issue, and especially if we have situations we think set up to cause loss. Okay, let's see. Regarding spoon feeding, I view side dressing as a way to reduce input costs by reducing the total nitrogen application. Okay, so and then it says, is this a correct view or only in some cases? So the issue becomes what is the exact correct rate when the year is over with? And so we know that the data shows that there are ideal years where you could get away with a lot less nitrogen. The question would simply be then, at side dress time, are we able to accurately predict that this is one of those years where we've got ideal conditions and we're going to see great mineralization and therefore need to supply less nitrogen? Some people are comfortable with making that decision, and some people are not comfortable with making that decision. I guess individuals will have to think about that from that perspective. I do think the extent to which producers in some circumstances may be over applying nitrogen and they feel comfortable with lowering the rate of application at side dress time compared to when it was applied at a different timing, that would have the overall effect of reducing rate. We'll take the win where we can get it. But from that standpoint, the research doesn't really show that timing is much of a factor, provided we didn't lose the nitrogen. Do the nitrogen fertilizer BMPs consider N2O emissions? No, they do not. That is a completely another topic for another time. I know that that NOx loss is definitely an issue that is going to continue to be focused on and looked at into the future. And so I'm just going to let that question go because I cannot adequately answer it. Fabian's raising his hand, so it looks like he maybe wants to. Right. I think, it's obvious though that the NOx emissions are going to be tied to denitrification. And so really, if we avoid denitrification loss, we are going to reduce NOx losses, but the NOx has not been measured directly regarding most of the nitrogen research that's been developed, that has been used to develop the nitrogen BMPs. Yeah, so that last one just kind of goes through some of the documentation. All right. Okay, thank you.